able to join me for the Expanding Our Roots interview series. The whole purpose of this interview series is to give you a chance to talk about your work, share your story with the community locally and globally, and to also show that Louisiana is a place of diversity and problem solvers, and we're not just one big problem to be solved.
Awesome.
And so I usually ask a lot of complicated, multi-layered questions throughout the interviews, but I never start with a question that is complicated or complex. I always start with a pretty simple question. And that simple question is, where are you from? Where are you coming from?
I'm originally from Plaquemine, Louisiana. That's where I was born. Now, everybody around my age, I'm 49, born in 1971. Everybody around my age who was born in Plaquemine was actually born in Baton Rouge at the hospital because at the time we didn't really have a hospital in my city. There's been some times throughout my lifetime where my city has been without its own hospital. And so that, if that gives you any idea of how small of a town I'm from, that should do it. So I always tell people I was born in Baton Rouge. And when I left the hospital, I went back home to Plaquemine. I grew up there, and I did move over here to Baton Rouge formally. I didn't live in Baton Rouge until my daughter was born. She's almost 30 now, but that's when I moved to Baton Rouge when my daughter was born. So yeah, I've been in Baton Rouge, I would say almost long enough to be considered a Baton Rougean, I guess.
I mean, technically, Plaquemine is in the Baton Rouge area. So, I mean,
It is.
Plaquemine is what, like 20, 30 minutes away?
Yeah, it's in the Greater Baton Rouge region, I guess.
Yeah.
Iberville Parish. And so, yeah, I'm proud to be from Plaquemine, but at the same time, I'm proud to be from Baton Rouge. Whenever I go to perform anywhere, compete anywhere, over the years, I've always told people I was from Plaquemine and Baton Rouge. I would kind of name both places to just kind of give them a specific area. When I first started doing that, no one had heard of Baton Rouge. They would always ask if it was near New Orleans. But I would say over the years, traveling, people know Baton Rouge now.
Well, what was your upbringing like in Plaquemine? Because all of my family grew up in Baton Rouge, and even though Baton Rouge is no New York or LA or even New Orleans, it is a city, and Plaquemine is a town, and it's a pretty small town too.
Yeah, it's a pretty small town. I would say it was country living. You know, it wasn't agricultural. We didn't work the land or anything like that. There was, there were some small jobs that you could get in Plaquemine. You could teach, of course, but there was the Dow chemical plant. And if you wanted a quote unquote good job, then you got a job at the chemical plant. And so that chemical plant provides a lot of jobs for the people in Plaquemine. But I would say nowadays, a lot of people commute across the river to Port Allen, Baton Rouge, and things like that. Growing up there, I didn't have a lot of outlets as far as arts were concerned, with the exception of we had marching band. And so I played the trombone in the marching band. I was the drum major my senior year. I went straight from there to Southern University, where I marched in the marching band at Southern University. And that, I would say, gave me a really good foundation to work in the arts, specifically the work ethic that it took. Because I would say marching band, for anybody who knows Black marching bands from historically Black universities and high schools, they're very aggressive. We were athletes. We had to march, 30-mile Mardi Gras parades and play the whole while. We would go on the field for football games and do these very elaborate, high energy, coordinated shows. And so it was the arts and athleticism all built into one. And I kind of applied that to my level of stage performance when I started doing spoken word. And I would also say it's also part of my approach as a professional percussionist as well. If I'm not working up a sweat on stage, I feel like I'm not really doing what I'm supposed to be doing up there. And so growing up in Plaquemine, as I've gone back over the years and performed at my old high school and things like that, I've noticed that they took 2 classrooms and made a small black box theater. And so they have a theater elective now that they didn't have when I was in school, when I was in high school, and some other things as well. And so I'm happy to see that the 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 options have evolved for young people who want to get into the arts in my hometown. But when I was growing up, it was kind of, you had choir and you had marching band. And I also did choir for a couple of years too. And so, yeah, really, really, really excited to see that that's evolved.
Well, I know that you do both spoken word, or at least used to do spoken word and poetry slam. And I also know that you are a percussionist, but I was introduced to you as a spoken word artist. And by the way, you probably were at Southern University at the same time that my mom was at Southern University. So
Yeah.
that's funny. I knew you as a spoken word and poetry slam artist, but that was in 2010. And you're telling me that you got into that way before I was even thought of. So how did you get into doing spoken word and poetry slam?
Like a lot of poetry slammers from my generation, a lot of us got into it through hip hop. And so growing up memorizing verses of hip hop songs, I think the first hip hop song that I learned the words to was Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang. And it wasn't an oldie. It was like, that was like when it came out, right? Again, I was born in 71. And so I had a front seat ticket to see hip hop evolve and come into being. And so all of that classic rap and hip hop, like I remember that stuff like coming out and people kind of scratching their heads trying to see if this was just some weird novelty or fad, or if it was something that was here to stay. For us, it was the music of our childhood. And so I got into hip hop, and then I started writing my own verses. And me and my friends would sit around and we would write songs and record them on a boombox. As I got a little older, the songwriting became a little more sophisticated. The equipment became a little more sophisticated. I joined a rap group. We opened for a few people. We had a little janky record deal here and there. And when I kind of got tired of that, was when I went to my first poetry open mic. And of course, I just got up and spit some verses from a rap song, but it was a cappella, sounded like rhyming poetry to them. And from very early on, I received a lot of praise, and it encouraged me to keep going. And then somewhere along the way, it became everything to me. It became my family, my church, the poetry community. Just was it was my social life. It was my only hobby. And so it was kind of all I did. I after a while, I became the guy, right? I was the guy who would show up with the sound system and hook up the sound system. Then I was the guy who would hook up music to the sound system and become the DJ. And then when it was time for the event to start, I'd be the guy taking the microphone and passing the list around, and I'd be the host, right? And then when it was time for artists to come up and perform, I was one of the artists performing. And so I just became really central to the scene. And then I kind of got into slam, tried it, sucked at it, but I had enough potential to keep trying. And I just kept showing up every week. I kept competing. Eventually, you do it enough, you get good. And that's what happened. And I started competing nationally, internationally, and I did that for a while. I think after 2013, I kind of focused on becoming not becoming a teaching artist. I started doing teaching artist work in about 2005, and about 2013, I was hiring other teaching artists to come work with me in different schools, and me, Johnny Rose, Desiree Della Giacomo, Anna West, we were all going into schools doing creative writing work. Anna West actually hired me, but then when she went on to do her own thing, I was running the show for a while at Forward Arts. And so, yeah, it's been kind of poetry was kind of my thing, and so I just kept showing up. I wasn't like born with any kind of special talent for it. I just kept showing up, and if you keep showing up, you get better, you grow. And Yeah, you're able to accomplish a few things.
It's so crazy to hear that at one point in your life you really weren't good at poetry slam and open mics. And when I met you as my teaching artist, you were like a national, internationally known artist. That's crazy. But thank God for growth. But I also know, but I wanted to actually ask a lot of questions about your journey because I met you as a teaching artist with Word Crew because I was a member of Word Crew. But I also know
Hmm.
that you were doing teaching artist gigs and workshops all across Baton Rouge. I'm not sure if you still do that anymore, but at the time, probably like maybe when I was in high school, 2010s, when you were very active with that, what was your favorite part about being a teaching artist?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, I'm only active at it right now. Well, right before COVID hit, I was going to Dixon Correctional Institute and I was doing workshops with the inmates over there. Once that shut down, I had to go snail mail. I'm mailing them the scaffolding for the workshop. They mail me back the rough drafts. I mail them back the feedback. They mail me back the second draft. So COVID has kind of made us start doing this whole thing via snail mail. But I haven't been in any schools in a minute. I've been doing that, and I've also been doing some stuff with reentry court for former inmates who are now reentering society, reentering the workforce. And I've been doing some things with them to help them become more articulate, to help them build their skills and being able to tell their own personal narratives as they go out into the world and try to create opportunities for themselves, and also as they try to reconnect with family that they've been missing. And so that's the work that I've been doing. So my favorite part, man, it's just gotta always be hearing the poems. You go in and you teach a workshop, and then it's time for everybody in the room to share. And that's just the most beautiful part of it is always going to be when it's time for your students to share their work, and you just hear these amazing poems. And sometimes they're not very developed or sophisticated yet, but man, they took it upon themselves to take the floor or take the microphone and share their work. And just that act of bravery, it's always inspiring. But of course, too, like you always hear some fascinating stuff. Even when the writing hasn't grown a lot yet, you're still hearing these amazing stories, and everybody's story is unique. And so I never get tired of hearing people talk about who they are. Um, Never get tired of connecting to that humanity within every student. And so I think that's always, for me, it's always just going to be my favorite part of teaching is experiencing my students' work.
That was also my favorite part about being in Word Crew because I was a part of the journey that had, people like Nay and Ben and Josh and all of them. And Suk would come in a couple of times. And then, of course, Dez was my teacher. Donnie was my teacher. And I love
Yeah.
being able to hear the stories of people at Fresh Heat, at Word Crew. And for me, I grew up kind of dealing with a lot of life experiences, positive and negative, and just dealing with that complexity.
Yeah.
And I can't say that I lived with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I also was kind of shielded and sheltered from a lot of the life experiences that many of my, work crewmates experience. And so hearing their realities, dealing with things like, gun violence, homophobia, all these different things really opened my eyes and changed my worldview. And this was before I traveled internationally, went to UNO, all that kind of stuff. It was right here in Baton Rouge that I felt my mind expand because I was introduced to narratives and experiences that were not my own. And I was forced to develop a sense of empathy. Well,
Yeah. I
I've
mean,
always been empathetic, but like develop a sense of, empathy for a more diverse plethora of experiences.
and that empathy that you already had can be expanded. It can be refined, right? I think every human being has some level of empathy. I would like to believe, but I think when you get into spoken word culture, so much of it is listening. You go to an open mic and you get that chance to read your one poem. So what, you're up there 2 minutes, 3 minutes, but then the whole rest of the night you're doing nothing but listening. And so that's the thing I love about being a spoken word artist is that you really uh, flex those those listening muscles, right? You really, um, I would say, you have the opportunity anyway to become a really great listener, and therefore you learn so much. We take so much more away than we bring to it, and maybe that's true for any art form that you really submit yourself to. But that's been my experience with spoken word. I've I've walked away with so many more gifts than I actually brought to the table. Uh, so it's kind of like this metaphysical potluck. You bring your little piece to the potluck, you bring your little dish to the potluck, but you get to taste so many dishes that are there that you didn't bring. And that's how I feel about spoken word. You just get so much more back.
And also, spoken word is probably a great way of understanding humanity, because when you're listening to a song, you may be focused on the voice, the music, and not get the message because you feel like, okay, well, I don't really like this genre. I really don't like that voice. So, you can ignore it or you can fall in love with it because of those things. But with spoken word, and also with singing, you don't know who wrote the song. You don't know if the singer wrote the music or if they had a songwriter. You don't really know where it's coming from. Whereas with writing and spoken word and poetry slam, you know the words that were written 99% of the time came from the person who's performing it. So that is that person's lived experience and reality. So even if it is not your own, or even if you don't necessarily agree with everything that's shared, you can't go to somebody and say, your poem sucked. You can, but you can, but at least when you hear that, you can have a sense of a conversation with that person about their reality through writing. I have also heard a lot of people in my life say, I don't like poetry, or I'm not really into spoken word, or I'm not really into that, to, listening to people read poetry. I mean, how have you managed that as a teaching artist who's promoting poetry and spoken word and those kind of things?
I think quite often when we say we don't like an entire genre, it is because we've had some small sampling of that genre, and we've made up our minds about it. You might have someone say they don't like hip hop or they don't like country music, but you don't really hear anybody say they don't like music, right? And so, if spoken word is not your thing, maybe you might be more into the written word. If that's not really your thing, maybe you might be more into novels or some other type of literature, comic books. But there are very few people who don't like any type of literature, right? And so I think if somebody is not really into spoken word, that's fine. I always tell my students, find the type of literature that you do want to get into. I grew up. I was a big comic book kid, and that was really all I wanted to do. Um, Today, as an adult, I don't read a lot of novels. I like poetry, and I like autobiographies and science fiction. And so, you got to find what floats your boat. But as a teacher going into a classroom, I do tell my students, even if you don't love spoken word, it is something. I'm here. I'm a resource. You can give it a shot. Dabbling in spoken word can lead to you being a much more effective public speaker. It can help you get over shyness. Um, it could lead to a lot of things. For one, I do a lot of well, not a whole lot, but I do some voiceover work. So post slam, I've been able to have some kind of a tertiary income as a voiceover actor. One of the pieces I wrote a couple of months ago, it won a national Addy Award, and so I've been able to take what I learned in slam and apply it to speaking in commercials. And so, yeah, if somebody tells me they're not into slam, that's cool. I mean, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but I would also say before you make up your mind, you might want to hear, some of the world class guys do it, because I will say this too, Jahi, like so much of our culture is open mic culture. So much of it is amateur night, right? Which, for lack of a better phrase, when you go to an open mic, you might hear a lot of people spit poems for the very first time, which is different from, let's say, if a poet who was a nationally or internationally recognized poet, was doing a big show at your local university, right? That would be a completely different experience. And so I think if people say they don't like slam or they don't like spoken word, they got to make sure that they're not basing that opinion on going somewhere and hearing a bunch of people who are just dabbling in the art form. I think if that's the only way we consume spoken word, then yeah, we're gonna kind of see it in a certain light, as opposed to, if I'm gonna say I don't like hip hop, I'm gonna listen to Jay-Z and Nas and Rakim and all of the greats. And then I'll let you know if I really don't like hip hop. But, you know, you can't really be fair in judging an art form if you've only sampled, some amateurs who are kind of just dabbling in it very early in their careers.
Yeah, I guess it's also the same concept with music. It's like sometimes people may not like a certain artist because they only hear one or two songs on the radio, but then when you listen to the rest of the catalog, then you're like, wait a minute, wow, I just don't like this one song, but these 10 I love.
Yeah, that's true.
And
That's true as well.
I wanted to know more about your experiences doing performance with poetry slam and spoken word nationally, internationally. Like, what was your experience like competing and going to like national slams? And then I think one time you went to France and you competed in an international slam. So I also want to hear about that experience too.
Started out locally. I started going to the slam here in Baton Rouge. Dr. Ray Sibley was running that slam, and I would go there and I started competing. After about 3 months, I made the team to go to nationals. That was in 2000, and I went there. I saw some of the best poets in the country, and I came back and I was like, oh, okay. What I was doing was it was amateur hour. Let me, even though I'd made the national team, when I went to nationals and heard poets from all over the country, what they were doing, I was like, oh, okay. If I'm going to compete, then I got to get on that level. And so over the years, I would go to these national competitions and I would learn. I would see other poets. Again, so much of what we do is listening. And so I would go there and perform, but I would also hear just so many different styles and so many different approaches. And I would come back and I would work harder. I think maybe in 2003 was my very first time kind of ranking pretty high on a national level. And then in 2006, I think that was my first time going to compete at the individual world poetry slam. Again, though, I would go to these slams and sometimes I'd do okay. Sometimes I'd be in the semifinals. Sometimes I wouldn't even get in the semifinals. I lost a lot before I ever won any type of trophy in slam. And I would say when I got to about 2013, I was like, man, I've been doing this a long time and I don't have one title. I've never won a title, And so I focused on 2013 on winning a title because I knew I didn't have a whole lot many more years I was going to do this. And I just wanted to kind of walk away with something in my hand. And so I focused on winning the title and I won the title. And it was a co-championship between me and Ed Mabry, but both of us hold the title of first place, right? It was a first place tie and we didn't break the tie, which was weird. Everybody wanted us to break the tie, but we were kind of like, we did all of our best poems. And so it just would have been weird to end the night with the poems we didn't think were powerful enough to make it to the competition. And so we were happy to split the title. And so for the champion of 2013, I say that I won and he says that he won, and neither of us is wrong. After that, I went to compete at the Paris World Cup. And I don't even remember if I made it to semifinals there because it was just so, there were a lot of bumps in the road, I would say. The American style of poetry slam is very fast paced. And because, it started here in Chicago. And so it's an American art form, sport, game, whatever you want to call it. And the American style is much more aggressive and also much more evolved, I would say. At least it was back then. And so they were projecting the words to my poems up on the wall over my head as I actually performed the poem. And the person who was controlling the PowerPoint could not keep up with me, and they kept getting lost. And so what I was performing on stage and what was being projected over my head were always two different things. Also, most of the audience was a French audience. So for them, English was not their first language. And when you have someone performing spoken word, not all of my poems are fast, but when I speed up, I really speed up. And so they couldn't always keep up. And so if I would have ever gone back to the Paris World Cup again, I would have made sure that I would not have taken the stage with the stuff that wins here. I would have taken the stage with some more slower paced poetry that would have done better with an audience whose primary language was not English. Yeah, it was a learning experience. You know, it's different when you decide you're going to go perform overseas. You got to take other things into account. If I were Jay-Z and, you know, they're listening to my songs before I get there, then that would be something else. But because I'm taking the stage and I'm doing poems that they've never heard before, their ability to kind of be present throughout the poem is reduced because of the fluency with which I'm delivering the poem. So yeah, I met a lot of great poems from all over the world. I met a lot of great poets from all over the world. Heard a lot of great poems, and I'm still friends with some of those poets to this day.
I mean, you could also be friends with poems too.
You can be friends with poems.
Yeah, I mean,
you
I
better
have
be.
some, but I also wanted to know because I've actually experienced the opposite from you. I do know that with language barriers, can't always understand what's communicated if you have to focus more on translating than understanding the meaning. But ironically, around the time that you went to Paris for the World Poetry Slam, that was my first introduction to the idea of poetry being global. You know, spoken word and poetry slam is typically an American thing. And I remember being asked to perform for the University of New Orleans International Night. And, you know, they have performances like Irish tap dancing, you know, South Asian performances, African, European stuff going on. You have international students from every part of the globe. Poetry slam and spoken word is not something that people from Europe or Quebec or the Middle East or Asia are used to, even if they like poetry. So I was performing as a showcase of African-American culture and American culture performing poetry slam. And I had people from Quebec, France, Nepal, Venezuela, Switzerland be like, oh my God, your poem was so beautiful. It was great. It was awesome. And I was performing it in a poetry slam style.
Yeah, here in America, there's a slam in pretty much every major city. And there's, you know, there might be a slam going on every college campus, you know, somewhere at some point. But when you look at some of these other countries, at least when I went to compete at the Paris World Cup and I talked to these other poets, quite often they were the top poet at their regular slam where they were performing, but that might be the only slam within a 300,000 mile radius, right? And so slam exists in a lot of these countries, but it's not as a slam is not as easy to find as it is here. You can throw a rock and hit a poetry slam in the United States. And I think that it probably has spread around. I mean, we had poets from so many countries, every continent. And so it is all over the world, but you know, some countries might only have one or two slams regularly happening. And so you had some of the people performing there were like, yeah, you know, I'm the top poet in Paris, you know, and it's kind of like out of the 30 people that do poetry slam here, you know, I'm the top of the 30, you know. And when I went to Paris I had won a previous world title that was held here. The world title that's held in Baton Rouge, you don't get a lot of other countries participating because, you know, it's kind of hard to come to the country where this thing started and really compete unless you are on that level, you know?
That's like getting a modeling gig in Chicago versus getting a modeling gig in Paris.
Right.
Yeah.
Or being a bullfighter from Africa. It's kind of like
Yes.
the Jamaican bobsled team. It's not something that's done everywhere, and so when people compete, they're not always they might be the best in their country, but it's really hard to compete with Americans in poetry slam right now because we do it so much, and I think as the art form spreads around the world, it's going to even out the playing field. And when you say you're the world champion, it's going to mean something different. When I tell people I'm the world champion, I do let them know like there's not a lot. I didn't beat a lot of people from other countries. The world title that I won is mostly an American title, and so yeah.
I often wonder, about like cultural diversity with poetry and how in the whole poetry slam scene, because when I watch videos of poetry slams in California, New York, you have people of so many different cultures, that do poetry slam. And here in Baton Rouge, there is diversity, but the racial diversity is kind of binary. It's usually black and white. And I often find in my experience that poetry is loved everywhere. I mean, I remember I was, in grad school hearing a student from Kazakhstan read poetry in Russian, or a friend of mine from Bosnia recite a Bosnian rap. So word poetry, wordsmithing, all that kind of stuff is a universal international thing. But I noticed that the poetry slam crowds in America tend to be, at least in Louisiana, tend to be very black, white, very binary in that.
We're still in Louisiana, man. I think that, yeah. I mean, you go to a lot of other cities and you see, like, you'll have a Latino poet will do a poem in Spanish. They'll do the whole poem in Spanish, and it'll be like, I don't care if you don't understand most of the poem. That's fine with me, and the audience loves it. And I think that Baton Rouge, we do have a Latino community here. We have an Asian community here. We have Native American community here in Louisiana, but we're still a very segregated state. Still a very segregated state. When I first started getting into spoken word and I would go out to the slams, me and my friend Mona Webb would be the only two black people sometimes at the event. And there was some other, the current poet laureate, John Warner Smith, he would be there sometimes. And sometimes he and I would be the two flies in the milk. Um, so we kind of integrated the slam, and then we started bringing in some of our other friends, because while we were going to the slam, which was mostly white, we were also going to the open mic that was being run in another venue, and there was kind of a black crowd there. And there was an open mic happening at Southern University every week. And of course, those were a lot of black poets. And so me and Mona would bring a lot of our friends over, like Donnie Rose was one of them that we brought over to the slam. And yeah, we kind of started to integrate the slam. And then a couple of years later, the slam was mostly black. It's like we kind of moved in, and it just really became, there were a lot of black poets that wanted to compete, and I think a lot of the white poets started to feel intimidated, and it became like it almost flipped, where at first you would see only a few black poets. It kind of flipped, and at one time you only saw a few white poets, and I would say now, most recently, it's kind of started to even out, and it waxes and wanes. It goes back and forth, but and we get a Latina poet here and there. We get a poet doing some parts of their poem in Farsi. We might get a poet who also speaks I don't know, Mandarin or something. And so we'll get a little more diversity than black and white from time to time. But yeah, it's still Baton Rouge, man. It's still it's going to be a while before Baton Rouge catches up to some place like San Francisco, in terms of cultural diversity, which is funny because Creole descendants have so many influences of other cultures. If you're Creole, and my people, my ancestors are my Louisiana ancestors are Creole Louisianians, and so you have that French culture, that Spanish culture, that Native American culture, that African culture, all of that kind of mixed in. But we lose it, after a couple of generations. I'm not. I don't consider myself Creole. I don't have what my great great grandparents had in terms of culture. But part of it is, growing and learning. My wife is Nigerian. We went to Nigeria last year. I got to really kind of be in the culture with her family, and eat the food and wear the clothes and go and see the sights and just exist among the people and soak up as much culture as I could. And I love that my sons know who their African family is. They could call them on the phone and talk to them. And so I've never retraced my roots, but I'm claiming Nigeria. I got people in Nigeria who call me family. So, I don't care what ancestry DNA says. I got Nigerian family, and so that makes me feel good. I haven't been doing a whole lot of writing the last couple of years, but when I do pick up the pen and get serious about writing again, I'm sure a lot of that is going to start to come out in my poetry. I've always tried to leave the door open when I was running the slam and hosting it. I always tried to make sure that everybody felt invited, and quite often, with Forward Arts, I definitely went out of my way to get like kids from the deaf school to start participating in the poetry slams, and before I left Forward Arts, we even had one of their poets make the Brave New Voices team and come with us to Brave New Voices to that festival and be the first deaf poet to perform at Brave New Voices. That was a poet from Baton Rouge. So but you can't just invite people. You got to go out and you got to connect with them and bring them back to your community. And I think that's the hardest part for people, because we all have our bubbles and we just like to interact with people in our bubble. And then the next step is that we open a door and we allow people to come into the bubble, but not everybody's going to come to your bubble just because you left the door open. Not everybody's going to come just because you sent them a text and say, hey, you should come check this out. You really got to reach out to people. I got to be willing to go to your spot and, go to your cookout before, I can be confident that you're going to want to come to my cookout. And so somebody's got to take that first step, and that's scary, but that's what has to happen for Baton Rouge to start to look like a lot of these other places in terms of, not in terms of diversity, but in terms of how those diverse communities start to intermingle. Because that's what we're really talking about, right? It's not that the Latino community and the Asian community is not here. It's that they're keeping to themselves and we're keeping to ourselves, and it is about connecting.
Baton Rouge is a very disconnected city, and it is disappointing, but not discouraging. I think that the work needs to be done to create more spaces in which people can step outside of their comfort zones and meet with one another, but that's not going to be an overnight thing. This requires a lot of patience, but also a lot of tenacity, just breaking down that door until you don't have to leave the door open. There's just a whole opening that you just can walk in and out and in and out. I think it's implied that you no longer do Poetry Slam as a competitor. So I want to know what kind of resulted in you no longer doing Poetry Slam. And you also mentioned that, you haven't written in a while, but you write every now and then. So I just also want to know how your writing has changed.
Well, when I was active, I would say from the year 2000 to the year 2013. That's 13 years of me being an active Poetry Slam competitor, which means on a regular basis, I was writing rough drafts. I was revising those drafts until I'd get about 10 or 12 drafts deep. Then I would memorize the text of the poem. Then I would create a physical text and a vocal text to go along with that written text. I would memorize all three of those texts. I would do that for each poem. And when I competed, I would go into competition with about 15 poems ready to be spit. It's kind of like when you're competing on that level, the level I eventually got to anyway, it's kind of like being an Olympic competitor, right? It requires that much preparation, that much study, that much practice and rehearsal, that much, crafting brand new material over time. And so it was a lot. And for the last couple of years that I was doing it, I was raising, I'd started a whole new family and became a dad again, And so, yeah, it just, it's very time consuming. So, if you're competing on an Olympic level, let's say if you're an Olympic gymnast and you decide you're going to sit on the couch for a number of years and become, middle-aged, and somebody says, "Oh, you think you're ever going to go compete in the Olympics again someday?" It's like, nah, probably not. Not unless I find a whole lot of fountain of youth to give me that energy again, and that level of focus, that level of I would call, right. I kind of referred to it back then. It was kind of a healthy obsession, but it was just kind of my only thing. My world has expanded so much. So now, I couldn't possibly compete on that level again now. You can't just get off the couch and go do that. And I would say I kind of did what I wanted to do in Poetry Slam. Now, I will say I am very intrigued at the idea of writing some new poems, memorizing them, and doing some shows. Because I think what people forget is that, yeah, you can get into a slam and do any poem. There's not really a such thing as a slam poem as an actual thing. You get into a slam and you do some poems. I think that for me, becoming a performer again is something that I would love. But competing in poetry slams is not something I'll probably ever do again, unless it was just, competing in a local slam for fun.
That makes a lot of sense. That definitely makes a lot of sense. But I also know that you have not abandoned the arts at all. I mean, in addition to writing, you also are a percussionist with the Michael Foster Project. And I know that you've been doing that for a while, a long time. And one of the things that I know as someone who also does music, I mean, when I was in word crew, I was also singing in choir. I was in classical choir, church choir. I sing at a lot of open mics. I've sang a lot, in most of my life, especially as a teenager and as an adult. And I know that sometimes how I express myself musically, whether it is when I used to write my own music to when I perform songs at open mics to how I express myself using written words, are almost like very different sides of myself, because there are some things I can express musically I can't express with words. Do you feel the same way, or do you feel like music and poetry, as far as expressing yourself, are almost interchangeable?
When I play music with the Michael Foster Project, it is typically it's an expression. It's personal, but it's also communal. We're a band, and so I'm playing with the 6 other guys on stage, and so it's much less personal in that respect. When I'm sharing a poem, it's very intimate. I think that for me, I love the creative process. As a percussionist, nobody really writes percussionist parts. And so you're kind of always improvising. So I'm always writing my part of the song in real time as a percussionist. But as a poet, I do love that whole process of building this intellectual property out of thin air. And starting with that rough draft, starting with that blank piece of paper, and coming up with that rough draft, and then molding that into a finished product over time. I do love that process, and I haven't done anything else in my life in which I've gone that deep with just the number of choices and decisions I'm making as I'm creating something. And so, with poetry, there's just always going to be that. And I think also that's just, there's the writing piece of it, but then also the performative piece of it. Again, it's like you're creating this vocal and physical text as well. So you're making all these theatrical decisions. And so I love that. I love that whole process of crafting a poem and then crafting a performance.
I can definitely agree with that. I mean, I don't perform music professionally, but I do know that when I'm performing a poem, I'm letting the world see a different side of myself. And sometimes that can be a little risky because, to be very transparent, I haven't really written as much as I used to. And I also have not performed poetry as much as I used to, not because I lost interest, but because I realized that a lot of my truly deep work that I actually feel proud to have written are things I no longer can share, because the poetry in which I present the most growth is actually the poetry that goes deeper into myself as a person. And so I don't want to share too much of myself out to people. Whereas with music, you're performing to entertain and to keep people enthused. So it's not always about you. It's about making sure that the performance that you present is resonating with the people, but you don't have to be so connected to it in the way that you would sharing a couple of pages of poetry that literally is coming from you.
Well, I mean, I think the beauty of it is that many of us do, like we put all our dirty laundry in the street, and it's not, and maybe not to say dirty laundry, but just laundry, right? We put our wardrobe in the street, and and that's very, very, very intimate. But of course, like when you do it, the audience really appreciates you giving of yourself on that level. Now, that's not to say that every poet has to reach to the back of the wardrobe and you pull the bones out of the closet, right? Some do, some don't. It's really up to you and what you're comfortable with. But as I've grown as a poet over the years, what I'm comfortable sharing now, I never would have shared 20 years ago. And so I would say over time, if you keep writing, you keep kind of digging deep and keep giving of yourself and expanding your voice, you get a little more comfortable with the intimate stuff, and that's okay because you've gotten more confident as a person, and you care a little less about being judged when you get older, and that's to me one of the beauties of growing, is that you're just so much less self-conscious, and and yeah, you're able to go a little deeper with what you want to do when you want to do it.
One of the final questions that I have is connected to what you're doing right now, because we've talked a lot about, like, your journey as a poet, as a teaching artist, all these different things, and you still do that. But I know that you are currently working with the Arts Council, and I know that the Arts
Yes.
Council has a lot of different things going on. So tell me what your role is and the type of work the Arts Council is doing that you want the community to know.
Right now, I'm the director of community engagement at the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. I'm also the host of their radio show and podcast, AC23. One of the main projects I'm working on right now, me and my coworker, Charbrigan Plummer, we're working on putting together the very first Artist Advisory Board. What this board will do, it will communicate to Arts Council leadership their thoughts and ideas about where we're headed in the future, what we're doing with our new facility, what we're doing with our Surf Plus program, which is all about helping artists get back on their feet after natural disasters. And so they're going to be doing some great thought partnering with us, some great idea sharing with us. And this board will be comprised of artists from our region. We have an 11 parish region. I'm not going to name them all, but it's an 11 parish region. You can go on our website and check it all out. Check out which parishes we cover. And we're looking for artists from all 11 of those parishes to submit an application and hopefully be selected to be on that artist advisory board. It's a voluntary position. There's no payment involved. We do offer a free membership to the Arts Council, and there's some benefits that come along with that. And we do offer free attendance at the Louisiana Artist Summit, which is going to be happening in late September. So we're really excited about putting together this Artist Advisory Board. And so I'm just trying to tell as many artists as I can to go to the website, fill out the application, and email it to me. And yeah, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to have the Arts Council on a regular basis hear your thoughts and ideas and opinions. And I think that is profound, because the reason why the Arts Council is doing this is that we want to be responsive to our region in a way that our region wants us to be responsive. And so our idea of leadership is not about us coming up with ideas and coming up with programs that we think people want. We want to have an ear to the street, so to speak, so that we can always be checking in with our constituents about what they want from us.
It's very clear that the arts has been a big influence for both you and I, maybe in different ways, but also in very similar ways. For me, I don't do anything in the arts explicitly. My academic background is far from the arts. And even though arts is incorporated in the work of the 821 Project, we're not an arts organization. But that being said, the arts have been important to my development as a person and as a academic involved person and as a professionally involved person. But the arts, very frankly, are not very well supported in public schools, in the public. Many people would say it's a waste of time, even though that's not really true. But arts education does not get a good rep, universally speaking, in the same way that STEM and other areas of study do. Why do you feel like arts education, or just the arts in general, are important and should be important to our society?
Arts is taken for granted because art is everywhere. You cannot find an object that was created, built by man or woman, that doesn't have an aspect of design to it. Every building that you walk past had an architect. Every car that drives past you, someone designed that car with pencil and paper before the mold was made and the car was actually built. I don't know if they use a mold, but my point is, there's art in our clothing, our fashion. Our clothes are pieces of art. Everything has a design aspect to it. I don't care if it's a dump truck. The latest model of dump truck that came out had a different design from the previous model. And so art is everywhere. And so quite often we just don't call it art. You know, we call graphic design, we don't call it graphic art, we just call it graphic design, right? But art is everywhere. And so I think because art is everywhere, we overlook it. We hear a rapper on the radio, we call him a rapper. We don't call him a poet, or we don't call the songwriter a poet, right? I think because of that, we have a tendency, you know, art is kind of the water and we're the fish. It's the thing that we breathe. And so it's everywhere. And so it's hard for us to actually see it sometimes. And so people say, well, I don't spend money on art. I was like, well, when was the last time you went to the movies? When was the last time you bought an album? You spent money on art, you know? You don't have to buy a painted canvas to say you're spending money on art. But again, we don't always see these things as art. We have a habit of making a distinction between what we call high art, fine art, and things that are much more common or pedestrian. And so I think that's why we just take it for granted so much.
I think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense because art is everywhere. We buy music all the time. We listen to music all the time. We buy a car because we like the design. We do a lot of different things in our
landscaping.
Yeah,
like
landscaping too.
It's art. Those are artistic decisions that a landscaper is making when they decide to trim a hedge a certain way or plant certain plants or flowers in certain areas of a landscape. Like, that is art. Those are artistic choices being made. And so we just don't see it.
We are conscious about our taste and our preferences. And we're also conscious about our interpretation of art. I mean, if we don't like a certain song or we don't like a certain architectural style, we are paying attention to art all the time. And without art, we don't really have much variety in the options of our consumption. I just think that, you know, people need to start thinking about art in the same way that they think about technology. I mean, if you won't buy a certain car, because you don't like the design, or you won't buy a certain home or rent an apartment because you don't like how the spacing of it, that is because of art. So if you can pay attention to design and going to a city specifically because you like the architecture, or not liking a certain form of clothing because you don't like the design, that's because of art. If you're that conscious of it, then you should support the poets, the musicians, the singers, the songwriters, the visual artists, the graphic designers, all those people, because they make the world interesting for you.
Well, I think that we spend much more money on art than we give it credit for. I mean, when you go to a restaurant, you're supporting a culinary artist, probably more than one back there in the kitchen, right? I think that there was a study done some years ago when a person goes out to a concert or a live show, um, they're spending money on gas, they're spending money on parking, they're spending money at a bar, at a restaurant. And so I think on average, they said they spend about uh, almost $150 on all this other stuff besides the actual show that they go to see. If it's a couple going out on a date, right? And so, or a group of friends is much more. And so the amount of revenue that artists bring to a city when they do a show is it's exponential. It's extremely high. But again, we don't take that into account quite often. We spend money on art subconsciously so often, things we don't even call art, like buying clothes and buying food, and not taking into account that there's a designer that designed those clothes, there's a culinary artist that prepared that food. And so quite often we just, Jahi, we, even us artists, quite often, we're not really giving art the credit that it deserves. And we're not stopping and taking into account that people are spending quite a bit of money on art. Now, are people coming to my show? Are people buying my book? That's a different story. I think that getting people to spend more money on art is the conversation we need to have. But I think when we accuse people of not supporting artists, that's not really accurate. It's kind of hard to not support artists in the world if everything has a design aspect to it.
And everybody has their taste influenced by life experiences, psychology, all that good stuff. So, you know, even if somebody isn't necessarily supporting one particular artist or artist, doesn't mean that they don't care about art. So that is a good point to make.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted that to be the last question, because I think that at the end of the day, even if you're not explicitly teaching art, you are educating people about art just by being an artist. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And also, as someone who promotes like global citizenship and social justice, obviously all the poems about racism, homophobia, sexism do use the art as a vessel to communicate a message. But when you have music that brings together people of different cultures, you know, you have different forms of music that can tell a story, because more people can pay attention to something if it's melodic or the voice moves you or the lyrics move you. We know art can communicate messages and help us have conversations about the world we live in, as opposed to just being, you know, like, things are happening, I guess. You know, like there's so much that is connected to art beyond what even us two can visualize and comprehend.
Yeah, I think that, I've always, there have been a few people who've referred to me as an activist, and I always correct them. I'm like, thank you, I'm flattered, but I don't do that work that real activists do. Just because I write a poem about homophobia, or if I write a poem about being an atheist, or anything like that, I might have a bone to pick with certain aspects of society. I might have a bone to pick with certain injustices, and I'm gonna respond to that as an artist. But um, I'm not gonna go around like telling people that I'm an activist. I don't do organizational work like that. I got a lot of respect for activists. I got so much respect that I don't want to, I don't want to try to steal any real activist thunder. I think there are artists who are also activists, but that's not really my role. I'll show up and I'll march in at your protest, but I'm not going to be the guy that organized the protest. Now, if we want to come up with a cool chant while we're marching, I might come up with that, you know. But that's my role, you know. And it's been a big part of my success. It's just been knowing my role and and trying to expand within my role, trying to expand my role as much as I can, but we're trying to grow within it.
Growing is definitely something that we all can do. And you're right. Not every artist is an activist. Not every activist is an artist. But even if you don't consider yourself an activist, I consider you to be an inspiration to me. So I think, and you've always been, at least since I've known you. And I'm so grateful that you've been able to do this interview with me and to share your stories and to share your experiences. It's some of the things that you've shared I am aware of, and a lot of the things that you shared I am not, but I'm so grateful to be able to talk to you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me too, Jahi. You've always been an inspiration to me as a student and as a peer and as a friend. And so I'm really excited. Anytime you want to sit and talk on camera or off, dude, just like holler at me, let me know.
Alrighty, I will.